Are we good? Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the HCRI Landmark Lecture. My name is Larissa Fast, and I am the Executive Director of the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute that has sponsored this lecture. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome Professor Alex de Waal, who is going to be speaking to us this evening about the return of famine, the end of liberal humanitarianism and the perils of mass starvation. So we'll have Alex will give his lecture, and then afterward, we'll have a Q&A session to follow. And there are also audience members on Zoom, so we'll take a mix of questions from the audience as well as Zoom. So Alex de Waal is Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation and Research Professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University in the United States. He's worked on the Horn of Africa and on famine, conflict, and related issues since the 1980s as a researcher and a practitioner. He served as a senior advisor to the African Union on Sudan and South Sudan in various capacities. He was listed among Foreign Policy's 100 most influential international intellectuals in 2008 and Atlantic 29 Brave Thinkers in 2009. He's also the recipient of the Huxley Award of the Royal Anthropological Institute for 2024. So I'm delighted to welcome Alex here and look forward to your lecture. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you very much, Larissa. It's a pleasure to be here. And I had planned to give a slightly more academic lecture about the last 150 years of famine, how we understand it, how we look at its changing nature, the changing metrics, etc. But as some of you may have noticed, it has been a landmark for weeks. And so I changed my topic. I brought it slightly up to date, but what I'm going to try and do is bring some of that elements from that earlier lecture to bear on the current situation. It's been a situation of shock, I think, for many of us who are in the humanitarian world. So there are the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And I think I'm, depending on the day, depending on the hour, in at least one of the first 4, not getting yet to acceptance. And I want to talk through some of the issues of anger, depression, and bargaining as we go forward. Because as we all know, that in the last 4 weeks, Donald Trump and his minions, and Elon Musk, who maybe is not a minion, have taken a sledgehammer to the central pillar of the world's instruments and institutions for emergency relief response, dismantling USAID. Now, that system was creaky. It was dysfunctional. It was in need of reform. But burning it to the ground, as has been done, is with the intent of perhaps starting anew, in the best case, is, I think, a radical and risky approach, to say the least. And it's unfolding by the day. There's a major court hearing today about whether it actually is lawful for many of the contracts to have been cancelled without any sort of due process. Now, so the immediate question is, does this mean the return of mass starvation? And I think it does. I won't dwell on that very much. What I want to look about is a deeper question, whether the illiberal term actually portends something more alarming, a sort of systems collapse, if you like. Now, this is not a happy situation to be in for someone who spent 40 years working on this subject, because 10 years ago, I think we could congratulate ourselves, generally speaking, the liberal humanitarians, of which I would count myself as one, that great famines, famines that kill hundreds of thousands of people, had essentially vanished. Not completely, but they had virtually gone. And this was a piece I wrote for the New York Times, a prelude for a book that I published the following year. I revisited it in the New York Times last year, and you will see I revised my opinion. The immediate issue then that I looked at in that column, though, if you're writing for the New York Times, you have to really compress what you write down to the most elementary policy relevant issues. What I looked at then was the funding crisis in the global humanitarian sector. And humanitarian contributions had been going up. This is in billions, the overall amount, the black bars through the UN plans, the green bars through others. A spike with Ukraine, but then a dropping off. And the dropping off was particularly alarming because this is a different graph. This is what is funded, the black bar, and what is appealed for and not funded. And it's particularly notable that actually in the expectation of reduced funding, the UN had been reducing what it was asking for. It had, as it were, been raising the threshold of what it considered unacceptable in terms of hunger. But what we saw then, a year ago, was a small crisis compared to what we are facing now. And what I want to look at in the main part of this is the bigger shift of global illiberalism, both in political systems and in the abandonment of humanitarian norms. So let me look to bring you all up to date on, well, up to this morning, about what is happening with USAID. I'll just spend a few minutes on that. So on the 20th of January, President Trump announced, and this was the day of his inauguration, by executive order, the suspension of all US foreign assistance for 90 days while it was to be reevaluated in line with the administration's priorities. Everything, blanket stop work orders were issued. And then on the 24th, 4 days later, basically all USAID workforce was fired, more than 90%. There are only going to be 12 USAID staff assigned to Africa henceforth. This is being held up by the courts, and there is a court decision expected today on some of these issues. But I would sadly expect that there'd only be a minor rollback. USAID, which was set up by Congress, has been dissolved without congressional approval, placed under the Department of State. A waiver was issued, or I should say a waiver was announced for life-saving humanitarian assistance, for core life-saving medicine, medical services, food, shelter, and subsistence assistance. However, the problem with this, first of all, it was imprecise. Secondly, anyone who thought they might be applicable, who thought they might be eligible for this waiver, had to find somebody in USAID or State Department who could process it, and they'd all been fired or their emails were not working. And then, even if they did get a waiver, the financial systems were shut down. So essentially, it was described a few days ago as a fraud and a sham by, speaking off the record, by a senior humanitarian, current, former, we don't know, official within USAID. And I very much fear that this is what we are facing for the immediate future. Now, let me explain why this is so significant. So there was US foreign aid funding, came to about $72 billion. Humanitarian assistance was about just over 20% of that. So let me focus on that. Though there's quite a lot of overlap between the other, like particularly the health sector and peace and security and humanitarian assistance. So that's about $14 billion. That is 43% of the global humanitarian funding, according to the UN. That is 46% of the budget of the World Food Programme, which has obtained a waiver, and it's probably the one organization that will be the least affected by it, because not least because it buys grain from American farmers. In some places, in Sudan, about 80% of the humanitarian assistance is coming from the US. In Ethiopia, it's $1.3, $1.4 billion. I don't know what the percentage is. I tried to get the data, and foreignassistance.gov has a landing page, but then when you try and obtain the data, this is what you get. The FuseNet, the US Famine Early Warning System Network, which was set up some 40 years ago, and has the most comprehensive database of needs analysis. If you go on their website, this is what you get. If the process of evaluating US humanitarian assistance is going to be undertaken, apparently all the data are not publicly available, so this will presumably be an extremely opaque approach to evaluation, subjective and opaque. I think one of the things we are seeing is the end of public data. We are seeing the shift of the entire data sets, health, taxation, census, humanitarian affairs, economics, everything into essentially proprietary ownership by the Doge group, which is Elon Musk. So let me look at, now let me take a step back and ask the question, this illiberal turn, what does it portend in the bigger picture? And let me run over a few of the elements that are necessary to understand this, starting with a few definitional issues. Famines, there have been repeated attempts to define what a famine is using various different objective measures, but at root, there's also a moral issue here. A famine is something that is an outrage, it's a failure, it's an anomaly. That's how we feel about it. But for some people, in power, it is neither anomalous nor outrageous nor unethical. It's something they do, something they rather like to inflict on other people. But what famines have in common is their awfulness for the people who are afflicted. Famines share these characteristics: hunger, destitution, and elevated mortality, death, though I will make the argument, actually, that not all famines kill people. It's not actually necessary for people to die of starvation for there to be a famine. In fact, many of the communities that are afflicted by famine don't really define famine in that way. Definitely hunger, disruption, loss of a way of life, but not necessarily large numbers of people dying. But the current metrics for famine, the internationally accepted definitions are derived, are the rather arcane formulae of the IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, which it has these rather intuitive color-coded maps, green being everything is fine, yellow stressed, brown crisis, red emergency, and 5 catastrophe, or if it is in a particular concentrated in a particular area, famine. This is their definition of famine, which has three components. One is acute household food insecurity, which I think is the most significant and important element, the extent to which people cannot maintain a dignified, sustainable way of life and are going hungry. child malnutrition, and some excess deaths, 2 or 4 deaths per 10,000 per day. There's also the legal definition, and there are 3 elements of this that you will find in law. These are from the Roman statute. There's the genocide, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Conditions of life calculated to bring about destruction. That's in the Genocide Convention. It's also very similar in the crime against humanity of extermination. And then you have the war crime of starvation, which is what Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant have been charged with, or arrest warrants have been sought for by the International Criminal Court. Intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare by depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival. That phrase, objects indispensable to their survival, is very key. It's not just food, it's also water, sanitation, shelter, power. If you don't have fuel or electricity for cooking, etc. Communications, possibly, maternal health, maternal care for children. And the key here is it's the process, it's the action, not necessarily the outcome. And again, this is an element of famine that is very important. And relates to the experience of famine, which is the loss of a way of life, being having conditions of life that are insufferable. And that means that famine sort of overlaps with war, with genocide, with health crises, outbreaks of disease associated with social disruption, societal catastrophe, state failure, etc., etc. It is situated in this cluster of concepts. Now, the definition that I've sort of fastened upon for what follows has these 2 key elements. There is the acute hunger, the loss of entitlement to food, the loss of access to food, household food insecurity, but also health crisis is very key here. The collapse of or deprivation of objects and activities essential for survival, because actually what I will show is that in many famines that we have studied, have experienced over the last 100, 150 years, it's actually the health crisis that is the big killer rather than the hunger per se. The 2 intersect, but the health crisis also has its own dynamic. I won't do a deep dive into the definitions and metrics. I will do that if I have the luxury of giving the more academic lecture. But for the history of famines, the data I'm just about to show, what I used was this scale developed by 2 colleagues, Paul Howe and Stephen Devereux, which fastens onto the simple metric of how many people died. And I used the Great Famine, 100,000 people or more, as the metric for various reasons, and collaborated with a group called Our World in Data in actually, me and my research team collected the data. They've done some fantastic visualizations, which I will show you. Oh, well, actually, this is what the catalog looks like, first of all. We have date, location, number, estimated excess deaths, etc. There are about 87 entries in this catalog and another dozen that we're still looking at, trying to get better data. So this is what it looks like between 1870 and 2023, deaths in famines per year. And you'll see big fluctuations in the late 19th century, early 20th century up to World War II, and then this huge spike, which is the Great Leap Forward famine in China, which killed about 36 million people over 5 years. And since then, something of a decline. This is the same data grouped by decades, which shows perhaps more clearly. And the great majority of famine deaths you will see over the last 150 years are in 3 countries. Soviet Union stroke Russia and its near abroad, so that would include Ukraine, Belarus, etc., Kazakhstan, India and China. That is, they are responsible, those places, not Africa. Africa is actually, in terms of aggregate famine mortality, is a relatively small contributor. But if we look at the last 40 years, what we see is two things. One is most of the fatalities are in Africa. And many of those that are not in Africa are in adjacent areas of the Middle East, Syria, Yemen, etc. These ones here, this is North Korea. And there's a decline from the mid-80s down to the early 2000s, and then a beginning of an increase. Let me just make one remark, because whenever I give a lecture on famine, there's always somebody who comes to me afterwards and says, it's all about population. They will listen to me talking for an hour about how it's about everything except population, and they will still insist, oh, it's all population. This is world population going up, this is famine deaths going down. This is the chance of dying in a great famine. There are 2 decades in the last 150 years where the chance of dying over that decade is 1% or more, 1870s and the 1940s. This is the and I could give a whole lecture breaking this down, population growth by location, by rate of population growth, et cetera, et cetera. There is no, you won't find it. You won't find it. So I'm going to look at 3 basic sort of plausible, parsimonious hypotheses for why famines went up and down, especially when they went down. And I will look, first of all, at food very, very briefly, because that's a rather uninteresting story. The basic story here is this is food prices between the 1870s and 2020. And you'll see there are various spikes in the 20s, in the World War II in the 1970s, but on the whole, it's been a downward trend. And this is the last 40 years. That's sort of stable and low. Even the so-called world food crises of recent years have not seen anything like a return, if I just go back here, to the previous levels. This was the world food crisis. And even this doesn't include the last couple of years, but even then it hasn't gone up that much. And moreover, global markets have been much more integrated as we go through this period certainly from the 1950s onwards. So much less volatility and fluctuation in prices. What we see is, and I'm still trying to get the good data and the good visualization for this, is it's places with armed conflict and blockade where you see the spikes in food prices in the last 40 years or so. And that's where food aid becomes important. That's where the global humanitarian effort, the World Food Programme, et cetera, become important. Sorry, this is an interesting slide, actually, because this is GDP per capita in 2011 prices, purchasing power parity, and these are the famines. And what's very striking here is that famines associated with natural calamities and economic collapse are all in this sort of lower quadrant here. They're all poor countries in the early part, basically before World War II, and with 1 or 2 exceptions afterwards. Every other case, obviously the cases where you get, richer or much less poor countries, like Netherlands, Japan, Germany, Poland, the Soviet Union, and more recently, Syria, Nigeria. Those are entirely conflict-related policy famines. And increasingly, as we go through this time period, the role of natural calamities and economic hazards, economic collapses just fades away. So, and this represents the data that we have on recent triggers of famine. So it's that same graph of mortality in famines over the last 40 years, but with the with color-coded for the immediate triggers. And almost all of these are armed conflict. And a few are genocide or government policy, the government policy being the North Korea ones. So this is, I mean, I can dive into the details, but basically the big picture here is that all the recent famines are associated with armed conflict, which has that impact, especially of disrupting food access. I'll get back to a few more elements of that in a moment, which is, and we'll get to food aid later on. Food aid is important here in cushioning this impact. Now, this is actually one I wrote up to now, I've been sort of summarizing data that was also in my book, Mass Starvation. This is new. This is an analysis based upon demography and epidemiology, which is actually very striking. The demographic and epidemiological transitions have actually had possibly the most important role in reducing mortality due to famines. And this is a tremendous achievement, but I think also an alarmingly vulnerable one. So this was from my PhD research, where I basically posited there were two ways in which mortality could unfold in famines. There was people tend to think intuitively, you have a food crisis, leads to starvation, leads to people dying. But I argued that in the case of Darfur that I studied, there was something else going on, which was in many ways more significant, which was the drought itself, that was the trigger for that, the social disruption and the economic crisis created a health crisis. As people migrated, as people mixed, as people congregated in places without good water and sanitation, diseases would spread, just the regular childhood diseases, measles, for example, communicable diseases, diarrheal diseases would spread and children would die in larger numbers of those. And where the food crisis was leading separately to people becoming desperate and destitute. And the two did interact, but the interaction could be overstated. This was then improved upon by two colleagues, Helen Young and Suzanne Jaspers, who had a much more nuanced model that combined the health crisis and the way in which the malnutrition of children interacted. So that you get this interesting non-linearity between the different types of infectious diseases and the malnutrition, combining in a non-linear way to have an escalating risk of mortality for these affected children. And the impact you see is very much specific to certain age categories. So this is the data from, going back to my PhD research, the mortality survey I did in the 1980s. And these are numbers of deaths. This is not the rate of death for each age group. These are actual numbers. So you will see that the blue columns are the numbers of any particular age group that would have died in a normal year. This is before the demographic transition. This is a high mortality, high fertility baseline population. And then the red is the excess, and you'll see massive excess in children aged 1 to 4, substantial in children aged 5 to 9, and then very high increases in death rates among older people, but their numbers were much smaller than the numbers of children. So about 100,000 people in Darfur died. There was a population of 3 million. About 100,000 people died over the 2 years of that famine. Now, so Sudan at that time was really only at the early stage of the demographic transition. So fertility rates were still high, mortality rates were still high. And if we look at other countries like Central African Republic today, they're still up there. But Sudan has moved. It's now sort of in the midway, and other countries like Palestine and Jordan are towards the other end. Death rates and birth rates have really come down a great deal. So here's the child mortality rates that have come down in those 4 countries. And you'll see the spike in Sudan associated with the famine I was just talking about. Though I should say, Central African Republic has come down least. It is at a stage now that Palestine and Jordan were at some 50 years ago. And the fertility rates in Central African Republic essentially unchanged. Sudan has come down a fair amount. Palestine and Jordan have come down very dramatically. So you get very different population pyramids. You get the case of Darfur I was just talking about. You get 18, 19, 20% of the entire population is under fives. In Jordan today, it's about 10%. So that shift in numbers itself reduces the vulnerability. And then you get the epidemiological transition, the reduction in those regular childhood diseases that are the killers. Measles, malaria, diarrheal diseases, etc., and respiratory infections. And bear in mind that it's the combination of these things coming together that is so crucial. So that's the graph I just showed. And in Sudan today, if you had the same relative increase in those death rates, you would get that pattern, a much smaller, less than half the mortality rate. And if you did it in a place like Jordan, if Jordan were to be afflicted by the same type of crisis, it would be even less. It would be about a quarter. So and here you are, and here's a comparison between the three. Let me move on. So the third hypothesis is to do with the politics, the political drivers of these crises. Amartya Sen famously said it's hard to find a case of a famine that has occurred in a country with a democratic government and a free press. And in looking at I did this in this data set, we have all the causes noted for each famine. I just did one of these sort of word maps, and it's interesting how the words that come out, 150 years, war, collectivization, colonialism come out as really the most important. And here is that Amartya Sen hypothesis sort of tested. So 3 different types of regime: colonial regimes on the left, 1850 to today, almost today. Autocracies in the middle, sorry, the slide has got slightly blurred, and democracies on the right. And you will see it's colonial regimes and autocracies overwhelmingly are those that see famines. And then I can do you a very quick historical tour. So this is 1870 to 1899. This is, each circle is a great famine. This number of deaths is the size of the circle is proportionate to the number of deaths. The brown ones are the immediate trigger being drought or another natural disaster. The red ones, war. The blue ones are government policy. And then genocide is very dark. So this is 1870 to 1899. Then first quarter of the last century, you see Russia in particular being devastated. You see King Leopold's disasters in the Congo. Interestingly, counterinsurgency famine in the Philippines. Second quarter of the 20th century, including World War II, there's absolute devastation in Europe and East Asia. Then you get, after in the 1950 to 74, you get Biafran War there, and that Great Leap Forward famine absolutely dominating. Last quarter of the century, you see, this is Cambodia, over on the far right, North Korea up on the top far right. And then you see that for the first time, the epicenter of famines really shifts to Africa. And then this century, very much Northeast Central Africa and Yemen, Syria. I think one of the liberal humanitarian project has had two tremendous achievements. One is actually providing food to these populations. The other is maintaining that epidemiological transition, actually keeping the rates of basically childhood in infectious communicable diseases under control, so they don't get out of control. Now, where they are failing to do this, other places where humanitarian access is most difficult. The data for this over the years haven't been properly gathered. So it's the ACAPS group has only data going back a few years. This is what the map looks like. The darker shades are where the humanitarian access is most difficult. But aid worker fatalities, which is another measure, we have 20 years worth of data. And here we see a serious reversal driven by a number of factors. Gaza, absolutely number one. I mean, Gaza, 163 in 2023, 212 in 2024, well over half the numbers in both those countries. So increasingly, a shift towards illiberalism, intolerance of the humanitarian system. But as those mortality data that I showed earlier reveal, we haven't seen a return to anything like what we saw, say, 50 or 100 years ago in terms of mortality. So the general findings, these famines kill many fewer people. They're now concentrated in Africa and the Middle East, and they're in illiberal regimes stricken by poverty. And then some cautionary findings, I think. The successes of our sort of liberal humanitarian venture, the one that is now under threat over the last decades, they've made famines fewer and less lethal. And they've done so, as I said, I think they do feed people, but more importantly, they maintain that epidemiological transition. They haven't addressed the underlying processes of deprivation, the basic causes of that render people vulnerable. And the key characteristic, therefore, I would say, of the types of famine that are unfolding in the current era is that victims are deprived of everything except life. So that the humanitarianism has succeeded in keeping people alive, but for what? I mean, it is good to keep people alive, but for what? And I think the liberal humanitarians and I count myself in that category, have been troubled by this. And we've always wanted to see the humanitarian venture transitioning to development, to stability, to peace, to building a better or more normal life for populations. But let me now, and here actually there's a great quote from the 1970s. It's interesting actually, if you go back 50 years, most of the scholars who were writing on these topics were from the global south. And this is Amrita Rangasamy, who is a remarkable and very under-recognized Indian researcher on famine. She never really got her due. And this is a great quote from one of the papers that she wrote. The sudden collapse into starvation that's been identified with famine is only the final phase of famine, when the stigmata of starvation become visual and the victims have collapsed. Famine is not an event marked by the death of the victim. Famine has to be mapped in relation to the objective of the beneficiary, or I might add, the perpetrator. As for instance, the imposition of starvation during a siege, which can last until the victims surrender. The mortality of the victims is not necessarily the objective. And this is true for so many of the cases where we have seen famine warnings issued by the IPC Famine Review Committee in recent years. Ethiopia, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, Yemen, and Gaza. So let me look a little bit about Gaza, because I think the USAID suspension, crackdown, demolition that I described at the beginning has a lot to do with Gaza. So the war in Gaza began, as we know, or the current war began, as we know, the day after Hamas's attack and atrocity on October 7th, 2023. And within weeks, the population of Gaza was reduced to a situation of extreme hunger. And then in March, the IPC gathered data, actually in February, sorry, the IPC gathered data that indicated that famine was likely to be imminent. Half of the people were in catastrophic food insecurity. You remember those color-coded maps that I showed? And this is a color-coded map showing, half of Gaza, slightly more than half in emergency, and the northern part in what is likely to, catastrophe, which because the data were not there fully, the mortality data were not there. They didn't say it was famine, but they said famine is likely to be imminent. And the Famine Review Committee met and issued a famine imminent warning in March. This coincided with a couple of other things that were going on. There was that raised this issue. There was an attack. A lot of aid workers had been killed, as I showed earlier, but there was an attack on American aid workers on the World Central Kitchen on the 1st of April, which caused an outcry. And also some US senators were had pressed the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, to ascertain whether Israel was permitting humanitarian aid into Gaza, because if it were not, then it would be in breach of a particular law which would require the US to suspend military assistance to Israel, which neither Washington nor Israel wanted to happen. And these things all coincided around the same time, at the end of March into April. And what we saw, this is from this is data from a paper by Francesco Cecchi and others at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. This is food availability in the north of Gaza and the south of Gaza. And particularly in the north, what we saw, this, you probably can't read this, but this date is like this is the middle of March. We saw a sharp increase. And that increase reflects Israel under pressure, decided, turned on the tap. It basically allowed a lot more aid to go in. And what we saw, this is a slide I compiled, which has it has two types of data. The black line is the data for violent deaths, the deaths that are recorded by numbers of people killed in bombing and shooting, etc., traumatic injuries. And up to 8,000 was the peak in October of 2023. And that's a very characteristic pattern of high spike and then decrease in wars of this type. And then the bars are the assessments by the IPC of the numbers of people in the two categories, emergency IPC4 and catastrophe IPC5. And you see, by May, it had gone down. And that reflected the fact that Israel was allowing more aid in. And the IPC met, and sorry, I should say, and so then a new report came out immediately after this, saying, okay, scaling back the alarmism. And two groups of Israeli academics, one nutritionist, one logistics people, came out with reports, and they said there could never have been a famine because Israel was, during a certain period, was the previous few months, had been providing enough calories, enough food to Gaza as a whole to feed the population. How could there be famine if there was sufficient food provided? And they took the fact that the IPC had said, okay, had walked back their assessment to say, oh, they were making it up in the first place. Now, this is, as we all know, nonsense, because famine is not the phenomenon of there just being an absolute shortage of food. Famine is when people cannot get access to that food or eat it, and other things like these other types of social disruption, health crises are ongoing, causing elevated mortality. So they were just taking one slither, the sort of thing that if one of my students had written this, I would have given them a fail grade, say go back and rewrite it. But they still, of course, got the Jerusalem Post got the headline that it wanted. Now, you'll get the significance of this will become clear a little bit later on. But then after a little bit later, in the beginning of May, we've begun to see the first sort of data shutdown, if you like, the first serious data shutdown. In that the UN was no longer permitted to actually monitor the trucks going in, and it became much more difficult. So this is the extension of that Francesco Cecchi assessment, which is the most reliable. It's still going through peer review, but it's an impressive piece of work. And what you'll see is that actually when Israel had managed to sort of stave off two things. It had managed to stave off the famine warning, crossing that famine threshold, and it had managed to get assent from Secretary of State Blinken that it was not obstructing relief, and therefore weapons supplies could continue. Then immediately the supplies began to diminish. First, immediately in the south, there was an offensive on Rafah, immediately after that, and later on in the north. Now, it's extraordinarily hard to get mortality data. We really don't have them. And I tried, this is an exercise I did compiled all the sources, all the methods, and they are incredibly variable. They vary from near zero excess mortality to well over 100,000. And my basic conclusion is we don't know, we can't say. I think it's likely that it's in the thousands, possibly the tens of thousands. But if Israel really wanted to refute the charge that famine is happening, it would allow humanitarians, people like you all, to go and collect the data. It hasn't allowed that to happen. And so in the absence of that, and with reports coming from northern Gaza of extremely severe conditions, in November, the IPC Famine Review Committee, which has met something like 20-something times over the last 15 years, decided for the first time that it would issue a famine alert without new data, because it basically said, we can't get the data, but all the indications that we have are that the situation is extremely grave and rapidly deteriorating. There is a strong likelihood that famine is imminent in areas within the northern Gaza Strip. Immediate action within days, not weeks, is required. There was really no immediate action. Actually, not quite. I will explain the action that did happen in a moment. The USAID FuseNet then came up with their report, their warning, and they did manage to gather some data. Not much, but enough for them to issue a report in December, which came out December 23rd. a famine IPC5, phase 5 scenario continues to unfold in North Gaza Governorate. So this, now what this would in the normal course of events, this, because the FuseNet is part of the consortium of IPC, this would have triggered the IPC Famine Review Committee of the UN to meet, and they would have then come up with their authoritative determination. That didn't happen. What happened was that for the first time in 40 years, a report by FuseNet was retracted. It was taken down. Ironically, on the same day that the Sudanese government expelled the IPC for exactly the same reason. They said this is unreliable and unacceptable meddling in internal affairs. And the two people appeared to have been involved on the US side. One was the US ambassador to Israel, and the other was a senior USAID official. And the rationale that they gave is very interesting. I mean, so here's Jack Lew's rationale. He said, the report relies on data that is outdated and inaccurate. It's now apparent that the civilian population in that part of Gaza is in the range of 7,000 to 15,000, not 65,000 to 75,000. And he basically didn't want anyone to say that the US policy was failing, etc. Now, if you actually look at the report, I don't know if you can read it. An update from UNRWA suggests the population may be as low as 10 to 15,000. The guy's lying. But the two things behind that lie are, number one, an approach to saying that there could not be famine because as the population had come down to that level and the number of calories delivered was sufficient, it can't be a famine. So the same rationale of that, that I was speaking about earlier, the basic food balance sheet. And the other thing is that how did the population get reduced? Well, it was driven out. Now, you will recall what the war crime of starvation is. And if you actually, I didn't put a slide up, but if any of you who are on Google, look at Article 54 of the first Geneva Convention, of the first additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, which prohibits the use of starvation to drive out a population. So basically he's saying, okay, it couldn't be famine, but it's a war crime of starvation. I'm just not going to call it that. You'll begin to see where I'm heading. This was an article I wrote for Haaretz on this topic. FuseNet took it down. FuseNet was now suspended. And I think this rationale of blocking data, reducing humanitarian action to the supply of calories sufficient for a population theoretically to have enough to eat, rejecting all these broader understanding, this 40, 50 years of professional expertise about what causes famine and what causes famine mortality. And going back to something absolutely rudimentary, that is actually what is going on here. It's not just dismantling USAID. And this is what the White House press spokeswoman said about President Trump's decision that, plan for relocating the population of Gaza without their consulting them and without their consent. It was made with a humanitarian heart. Let me stop at that point, because I think it's that reduction of humanitarianism to, I'm tempted to say, the barest bones, the most skeletal form of humanitarianism, combined with the rejection of the expertise and the shuttering of data that is, to me, what underpins this recent move. And I'm alarmed because let me put up my last two slides, actually. One is that remember what I said about the sort of non-linearity, the combination of factors that led a famine process, this sort of whirlpool, into that vortex. If we have the reversal of the epidemiological transition, if we have the abandonment of public health, we will go back to having mass mortality famines. And the other element, and this is a quote, one of my, it's a terrible tear-joking quote, but one of my quotes favorites, the vocabulary becomes problematic, from the siege of Leningrad, about what actually the experience of starvation is. It's not just bodily starvation, it's actually the dismantling of a society. And I'll leave you with that.
We'll go here. Yeah, thank you for that somewhat bleak picture of where we're at. I guess before I open it up for questions, I'll take Chair's prerogative and ask the first one, which is, I was really struck by the role or the amount of data that you were using, and your statement that sort of the closure of USAID means the end of public data, and what that means for famine. I guess my question is, do you see any other avenues to get some of that information back out in the public domain?
So people are just beginning to think about this now. So there is an attempt to try and retrieve what data are available using the Wayback Machine, etc. So the IPC, of course, won't be dismantled. The IPC is independent. It's based at FAO in Rome. But its two largest data sources, and number one has been FuseNet, and number two has been the World Food Programme monitoring. And we don't know, I don't actually know whether that's USAID funding and whether they will be able to continue it without, USAID. So there, other data will still be available, but it will be, less comprehensive, and it will be much easier for governments like the government of Sudan to challenge it, to say it's just not up to scratch.
Okay. All right, so I'll open up for questions. Maybe I'll take a few at a time. Is that okay with you, Alex? If we take a couple at a time, and then we can also, we'll do the first round here in person, and then we'll go online. So who would like to be first? Other than me, because I've already gone first. Okay, here and here.
Well, obviously it's going to be difficult for students like, it's obviously going to be difficult for students like us to be able to get jobs in the humanitarian and development sectors now that the money's drying up. Any advice?
I was wondering if that one was going to come. Okay, second question.
Thank you very much for the talk. I just wanted to ask, what can I and other people in this room do to kind of stop these things from happening, and repeating themselves, and taking an active approach rather than being passive?
Is there a third one over here, and the mic will come from the top, and then we'll let you answer.
Do you think that the Israeli blockade of Gaza opens the doors more generally for famine and food restriction to be used as an accessible weapon of war?
So let me take the third one first, and the answer is yes. It makes, yeah, creates a very permissive environment, and actually that was part of the point I was making in my article for Haaretz. It was just too good. It was too terrible a coincidence that this government of Sudan and the US in Israel did pretty much exactly the same thing on exactly the same day. And so yes, it is the answer to that. What can we do? So in the grand scheme of things, $14 billion is not a lot of money. If there was a time when someone actually looked up the data, when this government was, the UK was spending several billions, many billions on this, and it was one of the great sort of projections of soft power of the UK prior to the folding of DFID into the Foreign Office is a sort of small version run of by no means what's happening now in the US, but now and so I would say let's lobby to get the UK and the Europeans and others to step up and fill this gap. And I think look beyond the traditional donors too. And actually, the reason I went to Sudan in 1984 from Oxford, where I was studying, was that actually the most interesting and innovative work in this sector was being done in the global south, in places like Sudan, Ethiopia to some extent, India. And that leadership has entirely vanished. But the sector has needed decolonizing. So I think it's pretty grim in the short and medium term, but it is an opportunity for rebuilding this sector on a broader and more emancipatory basis, which relates to your question, which is yes, the jobs in the sort of establishment may be vanishing, but the jobs needing to be done are not. And back in the 70s and 80s, before humanitarianism got professionalized, what people like myself and others did was we went and volunteered for next to nothing in places like Sudan or Tanzania or on the border with Afghanistan, and actually got these, worked a lot more with local NGOs, and the system sort of emerged from there. And if that energy could be recaptured, I think it would be something positive.
Okay, I think we have one question at least online, and then maybe we can take one or two others. So go ahead, Salim.
Should I just read it out loud?
Yep, just read it out.
All right. First I'll ask this question is Ala Abdulrahman has asked, said, thanks for this comprehensive session that full of examples and rich data. I have some questions. In the absence of US aid, which other international organizations or coalitions do you think can step in effectively to mitigate famine risks? Or what new funding models or frameworks do you propose to prevent mass starvation? There's also a second question. How can advocates raise awareness about the dangers of famine in light of changing humanitarian paradigms? And what strategies do you recommend? There's also a third question. Can you provide historical examples where the withdrawal of significant aid sources led to increased famine risks? And what parallels can we draw to today's situation? Thanks again for this lecture.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so a great example withdrawal of aid was Bangladesh in the early 1970s, where Henry Kissinger, Nobel laureate, decided to suspend US aid in order to punish Bangladesh, and succeeded. The figure we used in our data set is 1.5 million dead. There are plenty of other examples, Cambodia later, of places where international aid withdrawal has been calamitous. If you go back further, there really wasn't an aid system to withdraw. Funding modalities. Now, the $14 billion a year gap is not a huge amount. Elon Musk could fund it at the drop of a hat. In fact, a couple of years ago, he was challenged. He was challenged by David Beasley, then head of the World Food Programme, who said the World Food Programme had I think it was $6.7 billion or $7 billion gap. And so Elon Musk said, give me a plan to solve world hunger with that, which was actually misleading because it wasn't to solve world hunger, it was to fill the gap. Beasley gave him a plan within 3 days, and Musk donated the money to his own charity.
I just want to quickly ask, what does that 14 billion in aid look like?
So my point being that the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the New Development Bank, they could all unlock new modalities for funding. And in terms of picking up the sort of the professional expertise, then that would have to fall. I mean, a lot of that is in the NGO sector. NGOs that had USAID contracts, and or UN agencies, and there could be funding mechanisms just saying, bring your contract and we will fulfill it, and then we move on to we will do a transparent type of reform and review in due course. Those are the sorts of things. I didn't talk about the UN. As such, the UN is in a very tight corner at the moment, and is really going to have to shift its entire sort of multilateral humanitarian system out of the US orbit, and it wouldn't be difficult to do if the political will is there for others to pick up the tab.
Okay, some questions in the room. I have one right here, and there's one there and one back.
Hello, and thank you very much. So my question, it was pretty clear, obviously, that conflict is the main driver for food insecurity, but I was wondering about your take on sort of the other way around, sort of under what circumstances could increased levels of food insecurity be, I guess, a factor or driver or threat multiplier, whatever you want to call it, towards exacerbating conflict as well, kind of creating this vicious cycle.
Thank you for the presentation, very interesting. Please correct me if I got this wrong, but on the one hand, I think we see a link between, as we just said, armed conflict and famine. And on the other hand, I think we saw something to do with democracy and famine. So one explanation could be that democracies are less likely to have famines then. But another explanation could be a bit bleaker than that. So I'd say that in the Civil War literature, I think there's quite a lot of inconsistency when it comes to democracy and civil war. But I think one of the most consistent findings is that democratizing states are significantly more likely to have a civil war. So in other words, a full autocracy, let's say we use the polity scale, a -10 polity, is very unlikely to have a civil war, and a +10 full democracy is very unlikely to have a civil war. Therefore, an alternative explanation might be that democratizing states are more likely to have civil war and therefore are more likely to have famines. So I guess the question is, what is your perspective on that? That actually democracies and democratizing states could be very much susceptible to famines. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, yes. So I have two questions, sorry. I just noticed in that when you speak about the end of liberal humanitarianism, and there's also it comes around the same time as COVID-19. And I wonder if you thought there was any correlation with that, because maybe more protectionist after this global quarantine took effect. And then I also wanted to know your opinion on the cash-based vouchers and transfers that the UN provides, because they usually come from measured on a US dollar metric, and they don't typically look at other surrounding things around access to food and all this kind of stuff as well.
So 3 pretty challenging questions. So food insecurity and conflict. I mean, there's a clear and well-established correlation, association between food insecurity, especially food prices, and civic unrest, food riots. And we saw this, for example, in Syria and Egypt, etc., in 2011. So, and that was one of the big concerns with after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the food price spike there. And it was a concern, not only for Western countries, but also for countries aligned with Russia, including many in Asia and Africa and the Middle East. The links between food crisis and sort of rebellion are, I think, much more complicated and harder to pin down. And for reasons of time, I think let me just leave it at that for now. But the link does go both ways. Democracy and war. So there are a couple of points here. One is that which I'm not exactly sure how this point is relevant, but I'm going to make it anyway. Looking back in the earlier part of that historic data set, you'll see a number of famines that were not wartime famines, but were caused by collectivization or other major policy errors, or collectivization is not always necessarily a policy error, but policies that caused massive food crises, mainly in communist countries, or Franco Spain, which is not obviously the opposite of a communist country for reasons of political balance. I'll put those into, and so in the absence of war, you have lack of democracy leading to causing famine. But but your key point, which is about the greatest risk being in countries that are going through some sort of democratic transition, and I would I think that's it's a very provocative idea, not least because we're seeing more transitions in the reverse direction now than democratizing. And I think it would be, so I take your point that it would be great to break down this rather simple threefold categorization that we did, and look at democratizing countries and find out where they fall. Rather unsatisfactory answer, but good. But also countries doing the reverse and seeing what that means. Yeah. COVID-19. COVID-19, I think, is an important part of this story, in that it very much contributed to the sort of the economic nationalism and the trade wars, which in turn is linked to onshoring and trade wars. And trade wars are sort of closely, can very much veer into economic warfare as such. So you can get war economies, I mean, a few countries like Russia, Iran, Ukraine, today being very much classic war economies where you have a fairly developed economy being restructured to finance massive military spending. But war economies have other elements too, and what we've seen in the US is that it finances its wars are sort of credit card wars. It finances them by massive borrowing, which includes, and the US can uniquely do this in a way that other countries can't, because of the dollar being the world's reserve currency. And whenever it borrows, and whenever it, because of the strength of its economy, other nations buy US bonds or invest in US securities and stocks, which means you have the irony that China and other investors in the US are paying the US. They're buying US financial assets. They're paying the US for the US to be able to run this massive military budget and dominate the world. And that is, and the US trying, and the BRICS countries led by China, trying to disentangle themselves from this is, I think, part of what is driving this economic nationalism, trade war economies. And then the other side of the war economy is the deliberate infliction of massive destruction, either through what the US can do, which is targeted sanctions. It's the only one that can really do effective sanctions is the US, and they're doing them like hell. Or if you can't do that, then you do it through blockade or through destruction. And you see what is being done in Gaza or to Yemen, or warring parties in Sudan are doing to one another. So COVID is sort of an element in this, because it was a combination of shaking that liberal trade order, and also the biggest ever unleashing of dollar financing. So a giving an extra sort of turbocharge to the US capacity to use the dollar as an instrument of frankly, war, which it didn't do at the time, but is what did to a limited extent at the time, but is actually one of the things we will begin to see now. Though Trump really has a real dilemma as to how he handles the dollar without crashing the economy. This could be the fatal contradiction in his project. Cash-based vouchers. I think cash is definitely the way to go in terms of not all humanitarian assistance, but a great deal of it. But there are quite a lot of wrinkles to be fixed.
Next round. Okay, so I have a question there, here, and here. So maybe start here and then move up.
Thank you very much. Building on the previous questions, I'm adding the climate change layer. So given human-caused climate change is an unnatural disaster driven by government policy, how do you fit climate change into your understanding of famine and future trends related to famine? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had a question about the rejection of expertise and then where expertise is now coming from. And in particular, thinking about the rise of tech billionaires as experts and thinking about the role that organizations like the Gates Foundation in the development sector have used as kind of to prove the expertise of these individuals and their money kind of buying them access that they wouldn't otherwise have. And I wonder about how that plays into this story, because obviously it's often cited as, as you said, then Elon Musk could fund these things, and very often there's an impulse to turn towards these individuals with enormous wealth to kind of fill gaps within that. but that also comes with a flip side of reifying those individuals.
Yep. Yeah.
Hi there. I guess this is more like an agricultural question, kind of linking to the climate change stuff. But in the agriculture industry, like we're seeing a big shift from monoculture and traditional agriculture to being more regenerative. And I guess, would you say that the type of food aid that's being provided is exacerbating food stresses globally? And is there a need for like a change in what we're actually providing in these situations to like be more sustainable in the future?
So let me take that last question first, and the simple answer is yes. I think that the whole food aid system as established by US Public Law 480 and whenever it was after World War II is basically a subsidy to large-scale industrial agriculture in the United States, and to some extent a few other countries, including recently Ukraine. And I don't think food aid can be completely stopped, but I think that a switch from that to I wouldn't say food aid providers should be from sustainable agriculture. I would say put the aid into cash and then develop separately other agricultural strategies. The climate question is a really important one, and it deserves another lecture. If you look at the three things to say really. One is, quite often climate change has been used as an alibi for food crises caused by other things. And so, because it's very convenient when the Saudis and the Emiratis are causing massive food crisis, famine in Yemen, for them to say, oh, it's climate, etc. To which the answer is, well, if you knew that Yemeni food systems were that vulnerable, why did you wage a war of starvation there? So there's the alibi factor. And once you take out the cases where climate or drought is used as an alibi, there still are many cases, Madagascar, which interestingly is remarkably a milder case. I had a slide in which I compared the severity and magnitude of current crises in Madagascar, which is the most purely climate one, actually comes out as relatively mild on the metrics. Somalia being another, where there are many factors, but climate is one, etc. So it is there, and it is recurring. I think the more interesting question is the way in which the climate crisis is causing all sorts of structural stresses to political economies, which are leading governments to take certain types of actions that exacerbate the crises, and to do with stresses, to do with migration. Another one that is important is, we're all looking for the carbon transition, the abandonment of fossil fuels. Well, let's hope the carbon transition goes ahead. I mean, the current trajectory is that those in power in the US and Russia and Saudi Arabia have decided, no, we're not going to go for carbon transition. We're going to use our money to escape, either escape the planet entirely, which is what Elon Musk wants to do, or to escape the effects. But assuming the carbon transition does go ahead, then a lot of countries that are currently fragile fossil fuel producers are going to have their revenues completely destroyed. Countries like South Sudan, like Nigeria. And what we've seen in cases where you have fragile fossil fuel producers losing that revenue, either because in the case of Sudan, there was secession and they lost the oil fields, or the oil price collapsed, as in Iraq or Nigeria, or there's mismanagement, as in Venezuela. You don't see democratization. You see pressure from citizens for democratization, but then you see the elites coming back and cracking down on that. So there's a whole nexus of connections, I think, that need to be explored there. And then the question of expertise. I mean, given a choice between Gates and Musk, we would go for Gates. Let's be, definitely. Given a choice between Gates and publicly funded, global health system based upon, taxation with the whatever, we would go for the latter. So that's, but it, I think, let's hope that some of the, the big private philanthropies, both sides of the Atlantic do step up, but let's hope even more that the shortcomings of a system, that sort of system, we're not faced with that.
Okay, I think I have two more questions on this side of the room, because I've gone to this side. And then, yeah, I think then we'll have to call it to a close.
Bertrand has been.
Thank you for the lecture. I was just wondering, in July this year, it'll be 40 years since the Live Aid benefit concerts. I was wondering, I'd love to hear thoughts on whether or not you think these large scale events, are they an ethical way to raise money and raise awareness? And also whether or not you think that given like particularly the cost of living crisis, does the West still have the capacity for that same generosity? And can they pick up the slack left behind by these states who are kind of repealing their own aid?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much for a super interesting and super depressing lecture. I have a very specific question about your research project, and then a question about where we go next. So on your project, if I remember this correctly, you focused only on large famines that killed more than 100,000 people. So I just wonder why you set the bar so high in a way. I'm sure there's a good reason for it, but if I'm not mistaken, that would exclude the famine in Gaza, which is obviously interesting and important, and you gave some time to that. And then the bigger question, I guess, is about what to do now. And you sort of answered a couple of questions on filling the funding gap, and I agree with you that that could potentially be filled, right? 14 billion or whatever. But what seems to me at least more worrying, I mean, the funding gap is more concrete maybe, but from what you're talking about, what worries me more is the blocking the data and the rejection of expertise, or famine expertise specifically. And I guess I see them more as a kind of cultural shift, and cultural shifts are probably harder to address. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on once you get the 14 billion donated by other donors, how do you address these other changes?
Yeah. So let me take, or are we going to have?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think, we'll stop.
Okay.
Because that was 3.
Okay.
So, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Okay. So I think the key issue is actually the one I thought you were going to go to, which was the norms. We're abandoning the norms, which is the point raised earlier, which is the more permissive attitude that it's okay to do this. I think, what I think is an essential part of the, as it were, the pushback, the rescue, the rejection, is it actually has to start with the norms. It has to start with saying this is not acceptable, that there and appealing and liberal humanitarianism achieved some quite remarkable things. It also had some shortcomings. But given that we're in a sort of post-liberal world, I think we should think about a sort of a coalition of post-liberal humanitarianisms, which is not illiberal ones. It is diverse forms of humanitarianism. And Hugo Slim has an interesting book about, humanitarianism 2.0 for the climate crisis. But we also need to think about other forms of humanitarianism, rooted in community, rooted in religion, etc. And also those, and taking the ownership of this agenda back, but from community states in the global South, using the courts, using the international law, using the UN Security Council, which passed a resolution on this. Just ironically enough, Nikki Haley was the American permanent representative, Trump's ambassador to the UN, who voted for it on armed conflict and hunger. So I think if there's a silver lining to this, it is that it is an opportunity for reinventing humanitarianism, recognizing what was remarkable and strong in the last 40, 50 years, but also its shortcomings. The question of why 100,000 is two parts to that. One is that going really for the 20th century and the 19th century, if you tried to have a threshold of 10,000, it would just be impossible. It was just methodologically impossible to systematically identify. I mean, there's some that there's some that we've put as sort of extra cases in the data set, like the Dutch hunger winter of 1944, 23,000, or the genocidal starvation of the Herero in Namibia in 1904, which was probably about 60,000. And so we put them in just as sort of markers, but don't include them in the overall aggregate. So it was, but then coming to the 21st century, where there's a lot more data available, especially from the IPC. And I didn't look at them, we've done some separate analyses of the IPC, which show some very interesting trends and patterns. And as you say, most of the cases that we are looking at either don't meet that threshold or don't yet meet that threshold, like Sudan, we don't know. Live Aid question. Live Aid, three things about Live Aid. One is the money it raised was important. What was even more important was it put it on the agenda of political leaders. But and at the time, many of us who were sort of in the humanitarian sector were very both skeptical and uneasy with the celebrity involvement, because we thought the message was being simplified. In the case of Ethiopia, for example, exclusively natural hazards were being blamed rather than government policies and war. So it distorted the message. But in retrospect, looking back on it, I think the critique was probably valid at the moment, at the time it was made, but as the humanitarian profession developed, it came to terms with that. It actually adapted and recognized those shortcomings and became more professional, greater reach, greater scope. And maybe that's what we need to do is inject that type of moral urgency. And it's not like people were prosperous then. People were, unemployment was high. People were hurting. People still, faced with these things, are prepared to give and to call on their leaders to give.
So perhaps that's a good place to end on a slightly more optimistic note.